Welcome everyone to In Conversation with Garrick Transell. Garrick has been involved with our organisation for a few years now, regularly presenting to our teams on topics in mental health and well-being. Today we hope he'll be sharing with us some different ways to address stress, motivation, mental wellness, and the formation of new habits. I think many of our clients have already started to begin operations in this overused expression, the new normal. Coming back from the pandemic, it's a gradual process. I think everybody recognizes now it's not as simple as just flicking a switch and starting up your business again. There's a journey to go on. Perhaps before we talk about the process of recovering and rebuilding, perhaps it's important that we reflect on what we've been through, and perhaps you can give us an idea of what you see and hear and what you think our state of mind is.
Yeah, it's quite interesting that I think when the news was first announced back in March or so, a lot of people expected that this would be an amazing opportunity to learn to play the guitar, to learn another language, to take on all of these extra skills and habits and hobbies that they never had time to do before. Yet now, looking back a few months, most people I speak to feel guilty that they didn't do any of that at all. And they start to realize that it wasn't a lack of time that they had during the lockdown period or during the shift of workplace design. It was a lack of bandwidth. And the reason most people struggled to take on any new habit or activity or routine was because we've lost a lot of our regular routines. And those regular routines, the real simple little things of the direction we go to work, the coffee shop we stop at, we get our regular order from the regular barista, we have the regular small talk, and we go into our clinic or studio or our practice or the office, and we have the same conversations with the same few people. All of those little routines act as like emotional regulators for us, and they help to sort of calm our brain and almost break up our day into little chunks which become more manageable. Yet for a lot of people that were forced to either work from home, work online, or shut their practice or office entirely, it meant that we no longer had those emotional regulators. So most people that I've spoken to have spent the last few months feeling a little bit like a rudderless boat, sort of just drifting through the day, going from emails to then a conversation, back to an emails, back to a task. And without those little waypoints in the days, I think a lot of us have struggled to find a sense of stability and forward momentum.
I mean, let's talk about stress, I guess. Stress is something that definitely materializes when there's a disruption to routine. Perhaps, it might be worth talking through why it's perhaps not the demon that we often think it is. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I guess if we zoom right out on stress and look at the different types of stress that we experience, we have physical stress, mental stress, emotional stress, yet we tend to group all of them together and think of them as one and the same thing. And most of the time, when we use the word stress, what we really mean is distress, and that's a feeling of being overwhelmed by the experience of stress. Yet stress itself is simply our body recognizing an external challenge and trying to devote more resources to help us rise to that challenge. And our body has a kind of a peculiar way of doing that. We have some body reactions that happen. Our heart rate tends to rise a little bit. Our blood pressure tends to rise. We get a slightly dry mouth. We get clammy palms. But then in our brains, we tend to go into a survival mode. And a survival mode was great when we were, on the savannas of Africa, where most of the time in humanity was spent evolving and developing our processes. That back then, when a stressful situation arose, usually that was a threat from another tribe or from a lion in the grasses. And what would happen is our brains would click over into this survival mode, which makes us very, very good at making rapid yes or no decisions. You've probably heard of fight, flight, or freeze as a mechanism. Essentially, that's an example of our survival brain thinking, where our brain first thinks, all right, should I stay and fight, and ask the question, can I beat the foe, yes or no? And you can make a very quick answer. If the answer is no, should I then run away, yes or no? Should I freeze, yes or no? Now, this is great if we do have an actual lion in front of us, but most of us probably don't deal with lions on a day-to-day basis. Yet the same mechanism is like an evolutionary lag that still happens in us. So when something changes at home or in the workplace, we have that same mechanism kick in, and it means that we become very good at yes/no decisions. But ultimately, in most of our work setups, yes/no decisions aren't most of the decisions we need to make. Most of the time, we need to be present, we need to be connected, and we need to be a little bit creative. So if we can learn how to turn our brain out of that survival thinking mode back into a creative mode, essentially that is us learning how to utilize our stress response a little bit more effectively.
I suppose the survivalist in all of us, the manifestation of that during COVID was, fear of the lack of availability of toilet paper.
Yeah, indeed. And we went, do I need to hoard? Yes or no? Yes, because I can see everybody else doing it, so I need to go and grab some very quickly myself.
Look, you've obviously spent a fair amount of time in our business and you've spoken to our team quite a lot. And I know one of the topics that you've spoken to the team at length is around the pillars of motivation. Can you explain, why you think it's important, an important differentiation?
Yeah, well, I guess we think of motivation commonly as also just a single concept that either we feel motivated or we don't. Yet some great research over the last decade or so by a guy named Dan Pink, who wrote the book Drive, which is fantastic. There's also Dan Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize in economics, despite not being an economist, is amazing. But what they've touched on is how the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation plays out in our day-to-day lives, in our works, in our offices, and in our studios and practices as well. And I guess the simplest way to think about it is that an extrinsic motivator is something external to us, which is often a cash bonus, but it can also be recognition, it can be validation externally, as opposed to an intrinsic motivator, which is satisfaction for the completion of the job or for helping someone else, for being part of a bigger cause. So it's those sort of higher order emotional states that gratify us. The simplest analogy to describe it is, say I wanted you, Stafford, to help me paint my fence. A couple of options to try and convince you to do it. I could say, hey, Staff, it would really help out if you could come around, paint my fence, we'll pick a sunny day, we'll grab a couple of beers and we'll just do it. And you could go, great, that sounds good. But if I were to take the model that most businesses use, I would think, okay, I need to incentivize this effectively. So what if I say, all right, Staff, can you help me paint my fence? Come around, we'll do the beers, the sunshine, all of that, but I'll give you $100 at the end of it. The problem with me giving you $100 is that it takes away any of your internal satisfaction, because at the end of the day, you don't get to feel satisfied that you did me a favor, and instead you're more likely to do the math and say, it took us 10 hours to paint your fence and you gave me $100. Do you think I'm worth $10 an hour? Yet if we think about how we motivate team members at work or how we find our own motivations, it's easy for us to tend towards external motivators. Yet we find that if we can zoom out a little bit and look to what our actual motivation is and find the intrinsic motivator, we feel far more satisfied for doing tasks. And if we focus on that in leadership roles, that means our team are more likely to do the overs and aboves, are more likely to do things that aren't strictly within their job description.
Look, I'm a pretty lousy handyman, so for me, you'd probably be better off keeping your $100 because you'll have to pay somebody else to do it.
To fix the bodgy job you've done, yeah.
It's my bad workmanship. I think you touched on it earlier, like in recent months, a lot of people have found they've had a lot of time on their hands in isolation, and some have indeed it's enabled them to take on new hobbies and get stuff done. I've heard of people cooking more and learning to paint, fitness in the spare room. But I've also heard of a lot of people that are a bit frustrated that they didn't use the time to actually do something new. As we go forward, I guess we're not just going to have to get used to doing things differently, but we'll have to find different ways to do things and stop assuming that the old ways will come back. So it's kind of like adopting a new hobby, isn't it? So we've got to form new habits, and I think that's quite hard.
It really is, particularly when we consider how resilient our old habits are. And I think it's a very common misnomer that you can break a bad habit. One of the most fascinating concepts is that a habit is a physical structure in your brain. It's not sort of just an idea. If you picture your brain as this sort of interconnected jungle of neurons all mushed in together, every time we do a specific task, whether it be like fold our arms a certain way, or the way we put our pants on, the way we put our shirts on, it requires our brain to send a very specific signal down a specific pathway. So if I go to fold my arms, my brain sends the signal of, you know, bend the elbow here, tuck the wrist there, do that. And it happens all automatically because my brain has recognized that that's a regular behavioral pattern, a regular movement pattern over and over again. So if we are to try and create a new habit, we need to do a repetitive task over and over again until our brains start to recognize that, oh, this is a repeated behavior. This is going to happen every day, maybe twice a day, maybe 5 times a day, and I should now automate it. So if you're trying to create a new habit, there's going to be friction because the first few times you do it, it's literally like trying to stand at an actual jungle with a machete and hack your way. The very first time you make a pathway, it's not going to be a very wide pathway. It's going to take a lot of effort and you're only going to create this tiny little pathway. The second time you do the same behavior, you make the pathway just a little bit wider. Third time, a little bit wider. And depending on the complexity of the task or, you know, the thought, because emotions can be habits as well, the way we deal with situations, it can take anywhere between 21 and 90 days of persistent effort until our new habit is formed. But the good news is once the habit's formed, it becomes really, really resilient. It's like having a jungle through the pathway that is so wide that we can walk down it without making any conscious effort. We could even text and walk at the same time because it's so familiar for us to do. So I guess the point about new habits is that if you expect that the habit is going to require a larger effort in the first 21 to 90 days, but then reassure yourself that at 21 to 90 days, it will get easier and easier until eventually it just happens.
Yeah, that's a fantastic insight. I think for everybody to be consciously aware of the effort that it takes, I guess, to form those new habits. You obviously speak to a lot of people or have spoken to a lot of people over this time, and I'm sure you've got lots of insights from that. Like if you could offer anybody listening one tip as they move forward into the new normal, like what would that be?
I'd say it would be about how we connect with each other, because I feel like many of us underestimate the value of our network and our connections. You know, for a lot of us, not being able to have the conversation with the barista at the coffee shop or the receptionist at the workplace makes a huge difference to our wellness, but also to all of those around us. So this is a chance for us to figure out how to stay connected to the people in our personal and professional realms, and to make a little bit more effort. You know, my morning routine is, you know, I wake up, I meditate, I go and sit in nature a little bit. But third on my list of importance is to reach out to 3 people. And that can be like personally or professionally. And it's just a real quick text or an email, just checking in to see how everybody is. I feel like that will make a huge difference moving forward, both to our own mental wellness, but also to our support networks to strengthen those.
So everybody, we obviously want to thank Garrick, but we hope more importantly that you enjoyed some insights that he's able to share with us today, and we will see you around on our next of the series of webinars.